All right, so just to take up this exercise then, just going back to the instructions here, the idea was to review a transaction, right? And we're going to do it wrong and then correct in terms of the success and failure. Not that they're wrong in the sense of the concept, but just in terms of the implementation. So we're given a scenario here with the We Adventure database. Just to review, right, so the customer itself is a parent in one-to-many relationships with both the sales order header table and with the customer address table. So we know from experience with referential integrity, we have to take out all the children first before we can take out the parent record. Right? It is a good candidate for a transaction because if we only had one action to carry out, we don't even need a transaction, but we have three separate actions here. Okay, to remove the orders for the customer address records for the customer, and finally then the customer, him or herself, right? So, what I had suggested is to download this little template for a transaction that we had done the other day, just because it uses the try-catch structure. I think most people understand the idea of the try is if at any point it hits an error in completing all the steps in the try block, it jumps then down, skips the rest, jumps down to the catch block, right? So if our commit transaction is right at the end of the try, then if it gets that far, we know we're good, we commit the transaction and we're done. If any errors happen before we get to this point, okay, then it jumps down to the catch where we roll back the transaction. I've threw in some print commands here just because I like to see a message come up to tell me which branch did it complete. Did it complete the try block or the catch block, right? So we have three steps. So a bit of a tip, the kind of approach I like to take in terms of completing code like this is to use comments to outline the structure of the steps I have to do. So maybe even like step one would be to, now remember I want the first one to do so that it fails, right? So maybe I'll delete the order, and then I'll delete the customer. Note should fail at this because we haven't deleted the address yet. And then third, I'll delete the address. Right? So then underneath each comment then I'll put in the actual action queries themselves. But it outlines, it helps me think about what it is, the three steps that I have to do here. So to delete the order, well, we know how to write a delete statement. I could use my query design tool, but it's pretty straightforward. It's simply delete from, right? And then the table, well, you know what? My order table is actually called sales order header, so I can drag the name out of the Object Explorer, save me from typing it wrong. And, you know, we're used to putting the where command down a line. Now, in the instructions, I gave you, right, the information right here on what the customer ID's number was, and he placed one order back in 2006 with this number. So I could definitely use that number to identify the record to delete, and that wouldn't be wrong. There's a better way we'll talk about in a moment. Notice all the tables here in the We Adventure database, the primary keys are all ID, not customer ID. The foreign key might be called that in some other table, but for example, in the customer table, okay, ID, same thing in the, here we're working in the sales order header, okay, the first column is just called ID, right? So I could say where ID equals my number for the, is that the right one? Did I pick the right one? Yeah, right? So that would delete that particular sales order. And that would be a valid approach, because I've already told you in the instructions we did a check and that's the only order for the customer. However, in the real world, okay, not that this is wrong, but a better approach would be to actually use the customer ID, the foreign key value, because, you know, what if there was more than one, right? Maybe he just ordered something 2 minutes ago too, right? So maybe a new record was added since we checked. So a safer where clause to use actually would be, we see here the customer ID is the foreign key in the sales order header that relates back to the customer's .id, right? So I could say customer ID instead equals, and instead of this number, well, right from the question we are given that his ID was 29531, right? So we weren't wrong to use the ID of the individual order, but this way, if there were by chance multiple orders, then we'll get them all, right? Because remember, we have to delete or remove all the child records before we can remove the parent record. Okay, so it wasn't wrong the other way, but this is better. Okay, so to delete the customer, well, it's going to be very much the same thing, right? In fact, the exact same thing here, except the table is different. It's delete from the customer table. Mind you, in this case, I do have to just say where ID, because that is the primary key of the customer table, and that would delete the customer's record. And finally, the third one is going to be similar once again, but it's going to be deleting from our customer address table. Again, following the same logic I talked about for the first one, I'm using the foreign key, right? Again, if we look at customer address in the columns here, customer ID is the foreign key relating back to the ID of the customer, right? And that way, if there were separate address, one for billing and one for shipping and so on, all for our one customer, we'll get them all with this approach, right? Some students I know going around the room looked up, did a quick select statement to find out that actually ID 28, right? You can see it down here in the bottom part of my screen. If I can get my mouse back. Okay. 28 is the actual customer address record for our actual client we're removing. So I could have written the where clause where ID equaled 28, but again, it's a better approach to use the foreign key. That gets them all if there is more than one. Okay, so this, oh, one other thing. Meant to talk about this at the beginning and I almost forgot. The name of this transaction is create customer. Well, that came from the template, like I downloaded that file. Does that make sense? Not really, right? I'm not creating a customer. If anything, I'm killing a customer. I could change the name to kill customer or remove customer if I want to be a little more politically correct. Remove customer. Just be careful though that I have to use the same name in all three places or I could easily get into trouble. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the name is actually optional. I could leave it out altogether. I could just say begin transaction, commit transaction, rollback transaction. I don't even need a name. The name is there primarily if you're going to nest transactions within each other so you can see which one it is you're rolling back. That makes it more readable, your code. But it's not a bad practice to get into the habit of doing anyway. So this version should fail. Okay, version to fail. And then what I'll do is I'm going to copy the whole thing. Version to succeed. And of course the difference between success and failure in this case, right, is that we would delete the customer at the end. So it's just a matter of swapping the order here, moving it around, right? So that'll be step 2 then. Okay, so we can delete the order, the customer address. Those ones don't really matter, right? I could do either of those first, it wouldn't make any difference. And then step 3, oh, darn. Okay, step 3. And this one should succeed, right? Okay, so if yours looks kind of like that, then you should be okay. Now I'll test it. By the way, if you mess up your database, which is easy to do when you start doing action queries like this, all you have to do is download and run the script again to drop and recreate the whole thing, the one from Blackboard. It'll just give you a factory fresh copy anytime. But I'm in my wee adventure, so Let me just highlight and run the failed one that should fail first. By the way, when you have bigger chunks of code you want to select, a bit of a tip, I like to hold the shift key and use the arrows on the keyboard, because especially if it has to scroll at all to see everything, once you start using the mouse, I find it goes way past and I've got to go back up and back down and so on and so forth. Okay, anyway, I'll execute that, and I should see in the messages pane, transaction failed. Okay, all right, and it rolled it all back. So if I were to do a select, I could prove that to you, but I'll let you do it on your own, just to save time because we're recording. Now if I select the other version, the one that should succeed, okay, then I get transaction succeeded. Notice the difference. I had one row affected message when the failed version ran. That's because the first delete actually carried it out, right? It had no problem deleting the actual sales order header, and one row was deleted by doing that. So it gave me the message, went on to the next command. That's when it ran into the error, trying to delete the parent record. Okay, there were still existing child records. But the second time, the version to succeed, okay, I see all 3 records deleted, and away we go. Any questions about that? Here, let me just pause for. Okay, so for part 2, put the transaction into a stored procedure named USP. That's just as a short form often used for user stored procedure when we write ourselves. Okay, there's a whole bunch of system stored procedures that just start with SP underscore. There's like 700 of them, right? So USP is often used to indicate that we wrote it. We're going to have an integer input parameter, so we can pass in any customer ID and have it go in and do this kind of transaction to take them out of the system altogether. That was the idea. Okay, so to make a stored procedure, well, I'm just going to go further down in my script here. Part 2. It's simply a matter of create. Procedure, I'll just say proc because I'm lazy. And we suggested USP, what did I say in the instructions? Remove customer. Well, same as I have here. Now, the next thing, as we learned in our PowerPoint, is to give the parameter list, right? So at customer ID, and I believe in this case our customer ID is just an int. I can check that over here right in the Object Explorer. And since I only have one, I don't have to put a comma, right? Because I would use commas to separate the list if I had multiple parameters, but I only have one. So the keyword as. Now I can, and I often do, just put begin, end, right? Just identifies for me visually that this is the block of code that makes up the procedure. It's optional, it works fine without saying begin and end. Okay, it's just kind of a habit I've gotten into. All right, well what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my version of this transaction that is successful, and I'm just going to basically copy it and put it in here in between begin and end. Maybe I'll indent it a little bit. Now of course right now it's set up with this hard-coded value, right? So it's a very quick fix then to simply change this to use my parameter. If I'm going to pass in a given number, right, then instead of hard coding which customer I'm working with here, all I have to do is replace that number with my parameter. And if it occurred to you that I've cheated, you're absolutely right. Okay? I cheated in the sense that I kind of maneuvered our conversation to talk about using the customer ID in the where clause of each of my 3 action queries. Right? Remember I said that it's a better approach than using the hard-coded value for an individual header, sales order header record, because it'll get all of the child records, right? Well, that also works now that I can just pass in the one customer ID, and I'll remove all orders for that one customer, I'll remove all addresses for that one customer, and okay, then I delete the actual customer. This will only ever remove one record because ID in this case is the primary key of the customer table. So this might delete multiple records, this one multiple records, this one a single record. Okay, so that basically would work for my procedure. Right? Now in the instructions I did throw in a little bit of something extra though. I said as a challenge, add an output parameter to return a status value of 1 if the customer is deleted and 0 if not. Right? So let me just go back and we'll work that in. So I will put a comma here now. Oh, actually before I do that, I want to talk about alter as opposed to create. So if I create this procedure, okay, check that I get a message that has succeeded successfully. And of course if I have a syntax error, probably a typo or something like that, then it wouldn't actually compile, right? So I've created the actual procedure. By the way, I can come over here in the Object Explorer in programmability. Let me just refresh, make sure. Okay. Expand stored procedures, and there it is. Anytime I need, as an object living in my database, anytime I need to, I can come in here, I can select modify. That will open up a new query window. Look familiar? Right? So even if I didn't save my script where I actually wrote the instructions to create it, I can ask for it to recreate my script anytime I want. Notice because I selected to modify, it comes up as alter as opposed to create. Because it exists already, so it makes sense. If we're going to change it at all, I have to say alter the procedure, not create. Right? Of course, there's other choices. I could script it as a drop and create, and then it would give the, if it exists, drop it, and then do it as a create procedure. That would be the only real difference doing that, just to prove it, right? So it drops the procedure if it exists, and then it creates it again down here. So there's lots and lots of ways to get the definition of my procedure back again, because it's actually stored as an object in the system. Okay. Now, so coming back to my original script, I'll change this to alter, so I can now add my output parameter. Okay. In the instructions for the question, did I give a name? No. So it's going to be a status value though, so maybe I'll call it status. That's trouble with caps lock. And I'll make it an int. But to be an output parameter, I have to say output. So what I can do now, right, is basically if everything works in my try block, it doesn't matter whether I put it before or after the print. You can even do it, I don't think it matters if I do it before or after the commit, because if there's any problem, it'll jump immediately to the catch block as soon as there is a problem. So I'll just put it right here. I'll just say set at status. Oop. IntelliSense equals 1. Because in the instructions we said that would be a flag for success. And down here, I'll set at status equals 0. And that way, as it goes through the transaction, it will set my output parameter to one value or the other. Right? And that's it. So because it's defined as an output parameter, it will just simply return the value. Okay. So let me execute the alter procedure command now. Command completed successfully. So it's happy with that. Okay, it's okay with that. Let's come over here and I'll just make sure I refresh this. One of the nice things about a stored procedure that I can also show you is if I right click and say execute stored procedure. This does a couple things for us. I might as well go through it to show you what benefit there is of doing it this way. Notice we can also script it as a execute, right? So that's another choice. But you know, it's kind of nice doing it this way. Execute stored procedure, okay? And then we can pass in a value we want. So I should have looked up another. Well, maybe I'll just pause for a second. Okay, so what I did is I just downloaded and executed the script to drop and recreate the database. It does mean that now my stored procedure is gone, right? So I'd have to turn this back into a create because it's not there anymore. The other thing is, although it looks like I'm connected to WeAdventure, the script drops all open connections. So here's a trick for you to help you if you're going to use a script like that to work the database and drop it and recreate it. First time I execute that, I'll always get this message. Transport level error has occurred because of how the script breaks the connection to all open sessions. But all I have to do is click it again. First time it'll fail, second time it will reconnect. So now I'm back in business, I'm connected to the database. Okay? So let me come down to part 2 here. I'll create the procedure once more. Okay, so now the procedure's here. Just refresh, make sure it's the up-to-date one. And then maybe I will show you script stored procedure as execute to a new query window. It's nice because this writes, it recognizes that we need variables, okay, for the output parameter and so on. So it declared our customer ID, okay, for the input parameter, our @status for the output parameter, wrote the execute command for us. Now it writes it in a way that it's looking for a return value. That's really not needed. So just to simplify the discussion for now, I'll just take that out. This fully qualified name, okay, I'm just going to clean up the script a little. Okay, so this is probably how you're more used to seeing it. Just like that, right? So we're going to pass in a customer ID, and so I would have to, as it says to do here, I would have to set a value for my customer ID. Of course, I could just replace this and pass in a hard-coded number, but hey, what's the fun in that, right? Oops, so I'll just put set, customer ID equals, and let's do our guy from our question. That's why I bothered to recreate the database so he'd be back again. So Corey was, again, 29531. So this script is all set up now to test the stored procedure, right? I'm assigning his customer ID. I'm going to pass that in here. My status, okay, will be populated as an output parameter. Okay, it will execute it, and then finally, I could do a select or a print. Select @status. As status. Okay. Oh, sorry, that was my go. Darn, and it already finished. Ah, okay. But we see the transaction succeeded. Actually, you know what? I made a boo-boo. Right? Let me go back to my script here. Okay. My 1 and my 0, I made a mistake in my logic. I didn't think this out before I did it. That's why I made it the exercise over 1. Status 0, I already know that transaction failed by printing my message, right? So really what I want to return is status is 1. I'm always setting that to true. Well, what if I couldn't actually remove the customer? It's not an error, but he just wasn't there, right? Instead of assuming 1, the safer thing here is to assign the row count. We talked about row count. Okay. When we talked about functions in our discussion of built-in functions, we talked about the add identity and scope identity, and row count was useful to find out how many rows were affected by the previous query. Well, the last query we did was deleting the customer himself, so the row count will either be 1 because we did successfully delete the customer, or it'll be 0 if it didn't. Does that make sense? Row count will tell us how many rows were deleted by the most previous operation, which is deleting the customer. So if it comes back as 1, we'll return a status of 1. If it comes back as 0, okay, then the status should be 0 because we didn't delete anybody. This isn't the status of whether the transaction succeeded. It's the status of whether we've actually deleted the customer ID that we passed in. So let me change that to alter once more. Highlight this. Execute. Come back to my test script here. Now I'll just execute again. Now the status is 0. And that makes sense because, hey, I have already deleted this customer. Let's pick a different customer. Just quickly, and then I'll stop recording. Okay, Orlando G. Oh, am I in the right table? Well, it seems like an awful small number. Okay, we're going to go with Kara here. Should have picked somebody else that would work. Okay, give me 1 sec. Okay, just reset the database. So we're going to record Corey, delete Corey once again. Oh, that's just because I've got to do my reconnection to the database. Okay. Oh, I know why. It's because I put the set okay, the print is before the set. That's got to be right after, immediately after the delete so that I can get the row count properly. Last time, if this doesn't work, there we go. Status of 1, okay, because we successfully deleted him. Sorry, that was my boo-boo. If I try to execute the same one again, my status will be 0 because he's already gone. Whew, there we go. I'll post that script up for everybody.